There was a guy back in the 1800s who studied the Psalms very closely, and he began to notice patterns in the Psalms. Sometimes literary patterns, sometimes thematic patterns. And so he began to write down those patterns and record them. And he came up with several different types of psalms. So he labeled each one of them, and now we have some examples of these psalms. And so I want to go through just a few of them with you so you get an idea of how, of at least one good way to classify the psalms. So we start off with a hymn of praise. And a hymn of praise is really easy to recognize because a hymn of praise basically tells about God's hand in creation. So if you see things where it talks about what God has done in creation and how God has created the world, or God has intervened in the history of Israel, this is really a hymn of praise. So I want to read a little bit of an example. This is Psalm 8. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes and infants you have founded a bulwark because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? You see how it talks about God creating the world? That's a hymn of praise. Of course, there are certainly other examples of that. So, for instance, in Psalm 48, we see these words. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. His holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of all the earth. Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great King, within its citadels, God has shown himself a sure defense. So we have a hymn of praise. We also have an individual lament. And individual laments are really easy to identify. First of all, they're all in the first person, singular. So they all say I. They also they follow a certain pattern. So they start with a praise of God. Then they ask for it's a plea for deliverance from some kind of distressing situation, whatever that might be. There are different kinds. So sometimes the psalmist is sick. Sometimes the psalmist feels threatened by something or someone. Sometimes it's about enemies. Sometimes it's about fear of death. Then there's a request for help. And then, in the end, there's always the confidence that God will help and respond to the plea. So I want to read just a little bit of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me, from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. And here's the complaint. But I am a worm and not human, scorned by others and despised by the people. All who see me mock at me. They make mouths at me. They shake their heads. Commit your cause to the Lord. Let him deliver. Let him rescue the one in whom he delights. And then at the end of this, we have incredible confidence. To him, indeed, shall all who sleep in the earth bow down. Before him shall bow all who go down to the dust, and I shall live for him. Posterity shall serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord and proclaim his deliverance to a people yet unborn, saying that he has done it. So we see confidence that God will deliver this person from whatever it is that ails them. Now, like an individual lament, we also have what we call a community lament. And that one usually is in the first person plural. So it talks about we and us and a community of people. And usually it follows the same basic line or structure as an individual lament. We hear an invocation, we hear a complaint about that situation, we hear about the confession of trust, although that comes kind of in the middle of the psalm instead of at the end. And we have a petition to ask for what the psalmist wants. And so look at Psalm 74. O God, why do you cast us off forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? Remember your congregation, which you acquired long ago, which you redeemed to be the tribe of your heritage. Remember Mount Zion, where you came to dwell. Direct your steps to the perpetual ruins. The enemy has destroyed everything in the sanctuary. And so this is about the temple and the destruction of the temple. And the people of Jerusalem, of course, are afraid because their temple is being destroyed. And they want God to come and help them. Royal psalms are really easy to identify as well because they have to do with kings. And it almost always is a king, either King David himself or within the line of the kings, of David's line. And so these are placed at intervals throughout the Psalms, and when you read them together, they kind of tell a little bit of a story. That first there's a celebration of the covenant with David, and then questioning why it failed, and then celebrating that Yahweh is the king. So an example of a royal psalm is Psalm 72. Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to a king's son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. May the mountains yield prosperity for the people and the hills in righteousness. May he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the needy, and crush the oppressor. So this psalm is looking forward to a king that is going to implement justice and righteousness in the land. All right, so that's the Psalms. And again, I know I didn't do a lot with the Psalms, but hopefully that little overview helps you understand a little bit more about the different types of Psalms that we see in the Old Testament. And remember, too, that a lot of these Psalms were used in worship, in different various worship settings. And that's what we use the Psalms for today, too, to help us pray, to be used in worship as songs, and to help formulate prayers and petitions to God. So I want to move on to the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is an interesting little book, and I think it's kind of hard to read, but some people like the Proverbs, and this is one of the wisdom books, and so we're going to go through a little bit and see what's happening in the Proverbs. So some different characteristics of Proverbs. First of all, the word proverb comes from a Hebrew word mashal, and mashal means a statement of truth or a standard of behavior. So the Proverbs themselves are short little sentences that say something profound about life or behavior or truth. The Proverbs are commonly thought to be authored by Solomon. So King Solomon, remember that he went to visit Gibeon and asked for wisdom. And so he is thought to have written most of the wisdom literature, which would be Proverbs and the Song of Solomon. Not Song of Solomon. Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. There are a variety of sources found within the book of Proverbs. So sometimes the audience is wealthy. Sometimes it's more folk wisdom. Like, we usually think of spare the rod, spoil the child. That's a kind of proverb. There are lots of opposites. We're going to go through a couple of these, but the biggest opposite is actually wisdom and folly and wisdom, foolishness and wisdom, the wise and the foolish. That's the biggest juxtaposition in the book of Proverbs. That's the biggest opposite that we see in the book of Proverbs. Personification. Wisdom is made into a powerful woman. And so we see that if we read through the book of Proverbs, you can see the role of wisdom. For instance, I'm looking at chapter 9, which says, "Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her animals. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table." So wisdom is here portrayed as a woman who has a house and servants, and she has set out her table to invite guests. Retribution theology. This is the same kind of blessings and curses theology that we saw in Deuteronomy. The wise are rewarded, the foolish are punished. Proverbs is a collection of poems, a collection of proverbs, typically by Solomon. That's what the first chapter tells us. And so we can see that in chapters 1 through 9, we have the Proverbs of Solomon. We have more Proverbs of Solomon that take us up to chapter 22. Words of the wise. Now, wise might be, wisdom personified. It might be wise men. It might be wise kings, different people. Then we have more Proverbs of Solomon. Then we have Proverbs from Agur. Then oracles from King Lemuel, and then an acrostic poem about the virtues of life at the very end of Proverbs. So I like what your textbook said here, so I quoted it. In general, proverbs that make observations on the way life is and how to succeed dominate sections 2, 4, and 5. So that would be chapters 10 to 22, chapters 25 to 29, and chapter 30. And the proverbs that are instructional, giving advice or admonishing, are more prevalent in 1, 3, and 8, which would be chapters 1 through 9, chapters 22 to 24, and chapter 31. So we can divide the book of Proverbs even further down into what's really going on here. And remember, again, these are collections of poems, or not really poems, collections of sayings, and those sayings are organized, mostly thematic organization. So I'm just going to pick a random chapter here and read a couple of these, just so you can get an idea of what's in the book of Proverbs. And so I'm looking at chapter 15. The tongue of the wise dispenses knowledge, but the mouths of fools pour out folly. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. A gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. A fool despises a parent's instruction, but the one who heeds admonition is prudent. A glad heart makes a cheerful countenance, but by sorrow of heart the spirit is broken. Those who are greedy for unjust gain make trouble for their households, but those who hate bribes will live. So you can see here how the greedy and the righteous are juxtaposed. You can see how the righteous and the foolish, or the wise and the foolish, are juxtaposed. That's the way a lot of the Proverbs read. These short little statements that are usually opposites, that tell us a little bit about life. They tell us a little bit about what God wants us to do and how God wants us to live. And as a good friend of mine once called it, he said that he always aimed for good, clean living. And that's a lot of what the Proverbs try to do.